Okay, so welcome once again. This is the second in our series of trainings on child abuse prevention. And some of you had the first training last week. Some of you had the first training, it's been probably a month ago. So just to refresh your memory on that first training, what was included. Actually, for those of you that just received the training last week, can you tell me what we covered in that training? Do you remember?
The definition of child abuse.
Yes. And anybody else?
How to report child abuse.
How to report. You guys remember the name of the reporting law? It's so significant to all of you to know. Close, camera. Yeah. California Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act. And we covered the types of abuse, remember the different types, and then we went into and gave indicators of each and all of that. Okay, and then we definitely went into camera and detail and your responsibilities as a mandated reporter, what that actually means, what feedback you're entitled to, that sort of thing. For today, we're going to be covering, just briefly, this is a 2-hour training, we're going to be covering the history of child maltreatment, prevalence of child abuse, so I'll have some statistics for you and some data, and risk factors associated with child abuse. Okay, so that's for today's portion. I think I'm doing this. I should have a clicker. So that'd be great.
You can put it closer to right.
Okay.
That won't be.
All right. Okay. So let's take a look at first the history of child maltreatment. It actually has a very long, extensive history, but I'm going to sort of focus in on particular points in history. So in the 1800s, children under English common law were considered property of their fathers. So for the most part, children were subject to abuse and neglect by their parents for some time in our history, without any intervention by any law or legislation to prevent that from happening. So they were considered at this time property. Okay. This tradition was actually carried on in very early years of the United States. And so again, nothing really established in terms of legislation and anything to protect children under the law. It was pretty much the discretion of the parent. It wasn't until a very breakthrough case in 1870, and this case is really considered a catalyst, if you will, for child abuse prevention legislation, among other things, because there were programs and everything else that came out after this point. But this particular case in history, in 1870, the case of Mary Ellen, who was an 8-year-old orphan, who was really severely routinely abused by her caretaker. Okay, and this was in a home, and she was routinely whipped and beaten and chained and all those sorts of things that would definitely, we would all agree, would constitute as child abuse. So this particular case, just want you to know if you have any, if you've had any other trainings regarding mandated reporting or child abuse, they typically reference this case as being sort of what prompted all the legislation and laws that we have in place now. Okay. What was interesting about this case is that it did go to trial. Okay, and actually the woman in question, who was the abuser, really in the scope of things didn't get much. I think she got very little jail time, very little fines. I think it was like a year in jail, something like that. It was very minimal. But what happened as a result, the attorneys for the child were with the Association and Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So it's kind of interesting that there was this association established to protect animals, dogs and cats and pets, but there was nothing to protect our children. So people thought, what, huh? Kind of doesn't make sense that we have something in place like this. And so from there, it was really shortly after that New York Society were able to establish a prevention for cruelty to children. It was a society that was made up, okay, of professionals. So that was established, and then that really is what then set the stage for further laws. Okay. Okay. In 1962, in a journal that was published in the American Medical Association, one of their articles that was published in that scientific journal, stated that child abuse was actually medically diagnosable. Okay, and that was the language within that article, that it was medically diagnosable, which means, wait a minute, this is something that we can look at and we can identify. Okay, and so this prompted a lot of attention when this came out, and it was from that time period that basically all states started developing and passing what we know of as CANRA and the different child abuse reporting laws. Okay, and states individually have their own laws regarding reporting. For the most part, there's a lot of overlap. We cover CANRA specific to California, but every state does have their own reporting law and reporting entity. You know, they may not be called DCFS, but they'll be called something similar to that, CPS, or something that's like that. However, just know that this is from this time is when we're having reporting laws now being put in place by states, and then the federal law came into place. And the federal law just went a little bit beyond that, putting support in terms of monies for programs. Actually putting programs in place that educate parents and provide resources to parents, and trying to get the word out and outreaching. And beyond that, they did a lot of evaluation and that type of thing. So a lot of the data that we have available is through the federal law. It's been made available. Any questions about any of this? Because I tend to go at a pretty quick pace. So, okay. All right. What are some national statistics? So for the U.S., basically, what do we know? Approximately, and if you look back a few years, 5 years or so, you'll still see that it's around 3 million reports made to CPS every year. That doesn't mean 3 million are investigated every year. It just means that overall these are 3 million that went into the system. And we're going to talk specifically about California, how many. 75% of the cases in 2009 were due to neglect. And if you remember last time we talked about neglect, general and severe neglect, we're talking about cases of neglect here. Okay, so it's a huge percentage. A child abuse report is made every 10 seconds. Of those fatalities, which there were 1,676 fatalities, so the children actually died in these cases, 80% were under 4. Okay, so that's significant too. 80% of the perpetrators in child abuse cases are parents. Okay? In the majority of cases, they are the mother parenting alone. Caucasian was the highest percentage of the perpetrators when they broke it down ethnic-wise, 44%. And overall, and this is for 2009, that was the most recent data published in the report, 124,000 children were removed from their homes. So just some national things. California stats, just a few for you here, 80,000 cases of substantiated child abuse. So what did we say was substantiated? Okay, there's actually evidence that abuse occurred. Okay, if I recall correctly, though, for 2009, there was about I want to say, if it was 200,000 that came in. Okay, that came in for California. So 80,000 were the ones that actually had some merit to them, and 185 fatalities. So of that other number that we just saw, the 1,600 number for fatalities for the nation, 185 are from California. And female to male statistics are pretty split. So as far as children and when you break it down, boys and girls, it's not like girls outnumber boys in terms of overall abuse. We see pretty much both are being abused at about the same percentage. Okay, some other statistics. Over 90% of abusive parents do not have a psychotic or criminal personality. Okay, we will be touching on some profiles today, some indicators, risk factors. You will see some different elements that kind of touch on possibility of psychiatric history, that kind of thing. But keep in mind, again, over 90% of abusive parents do not have psychotic or criminal personality. What you'll be seeing is oftentimes it's a multitude of factors. Okay, stressors, economic, single parenting versus having more than one support there. Where are we? Okay, 10 to 40% of child abusers experienced abuse as a child. That's a pretty significant number. Okay. It's kind of a weird.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. I haven't heard one like that before. So that was a little different. And mortality rates are highest for children under 2. Okay, so that is the highest percentage in terms of not surviving for child abuse, which we already said that in the other slide for the national statistics. Okay, a little bit more. This is kind of a little more specific to sexual abuse. We have some information on that. Sexual abuse most commonly occurs by an individual known by the victim. You've probably heard this over and over again on the media, right? By the victim, either a parent or other family member. We call this intrafamilial abuse. Okay, so it's within the family. Those are in most of the cases. Or a close friend of the family. So the child goes for the weekend or whatnot with this friend of the family. 97% of sexual abuse offenders are male. We do know that. 10 years older than their victims on average. Most common age for onset of sexual abuse is 10. And abuse of daughters by fathers is the most common form of incest. That's what we see data-wise. Okay, and from time to time I throw some profiles in here for you. Again, it's a profile. It doesn't mean that persons that have these particular characteristics absolutely are abusers. It's just what we've seen when we've looked time and time again at cases. There tends to be some characteristics that stick out and they have in common, okay, among these people. So, an incestuous father profile. Rigid, patriarchal, okay, emotionally immature. Alcoholic or drug abuse is very common, and you're going to see that throughout many of the slides, okay, with child abuse. There's a high correlation between just substance abuse in general and child abuse. And usually do not engage in extramarital affairs. That's kind of a very general profile of an incestuous father. Okay, and if you remember, we talked about in one of our other trainings, if you remember, we talked about the different parenting styles. You guys kind of remember that? And we talked about authoritarian, authoritative. So this would be more along the lines of an authoritarian parenting style, where there's not much interest in the feeling or opinion of the child. It's you don't question me, this is what you do. That kind of thing. So we typically tend to see that with these individuals. And for those of you who haven't had that training, you'll be having that training, so you will know that. Mothers in these homes, again, just a profile general, are often depressed, chronically ill. Work takes them away from home, so they're absent for certain lapses of time, show little or no interest in their husbands sexually. So these are some commonalities that we tend to see in these relationships. Okay, this is more of the victim profile. Okay, pedophile victim profile. So in other words, these are the children that are being sexually abused. This tends to be a general profile of what we see. Mentally and physically handicapped, unloved, unwanted children, previously abused, children of single-parent families, children of drug-abusing parents, children with low self-esteem, and children who are poor achievers. So again, this is kind of a general profile. It doesn't mean you may get some that are outside of that, but those are some common elements of when we look at these victims over and over.